I really like this a lot. I think, in a way, I wonder whether you could extend the analysis of Hutchinson to encompass it re-encompasses the antinomian controversy in that this becomes, on both sides, an argument about who is listening properly. That is, Winthrop, the ministers, are antagonistic toward Hutchinson because she is not listening to them properly. And I wonder whether, at least they can make that argument. So I simply sort of throw that out as a way of conceivably widening the emphasis upon the oral to encompass all of the parties to the controversy.
Yeah. Oh, I wanted to. I think this distinction between the visual and the oral, and the ascendancy of the visual in modernity, is fascinating for precisely the reasons that you announced in your comment. And I particularly just wanted to point out this question that's fascinating about the relationship of the two to different orders of truth. That is the immediacy of hearing closer in some way, sharper, versus a visual which slides towards interpretation? It's a question that I've thought about in the context of prophecy or callings in the Jewish tradition, because there is an ever-increasing imagery of prophecy as a visual experience, right? So it becomes a visual experience as the Bible goes on, and it becomes extremely thematized as visual in the rabbinic imagination. And then it becomes almost indistinguishable, right, from the classical prophets to later, from interpretation. And because one of the dilemmas of prophecy, because how then, how do you trust the prophet? He's an interpreter.
So I want to go back to the other side of the trial, Winthrop's side, because in some ways he's a straw Puritan in your story. And I'm wondering what his evidentiary structure is. So, it's not simply it's not that the Puritans believed in a covenant of works. They did believe in grace. They simply, as you pointed out, believed that there were indicia of that in the real world. So, Cotton Mather, for example, believed that the way someone died was indicative of the fact of whether he was saved or not, and would have grace. And of course, he died very, very painfully and in a very humiliating way, and of course that was deeply troubling to his followers. So there are all these problems. In 1637, there's the Pequot War, and at that very moment, the small settlement in New England is almost wiped out, and that was also a deep challenge to the indicia of grace. So there was a kind of a whole evidentiary system built up around indicia, and suddenly it's eroding at this time. So I'm wondering what happens if you get a fuller picture of Winthrop's side of the question as you deal with Hutchinson's.
Thank you very much for both expositions. I'd like first to refer to Professor Goodman. I think Professor Ferrani clearly made the case that this distinction between the visual and the vocal perhaps goes back. While you're talking, I recall perhaps I think that the criticism of legalism by St. Paul could also be formulated as also putting the written letter vis-a-vis the inner voice of the conscious. And at least it was perceived by some of the reforms. And by the way, I think Agamben exactly picks on that when he says that the Western culture in general is a move towards visualization against, and he calls to go back to the vocal. And you could also see that in the history of the Jewish thought, for example, with the construction of prophecy vis-a-vis wisdom. Wise men think and reason, while the prophets, as Suzanne said, they they listen. Now, another comment which I will be interested to see how it goes on. Hannah Arendt has comments about the idea of the concept of persona within the law as the mask, and that. But actually, etymologically speaking, persona in Latin comes from personar, namely to sound through, right? Sorry? Oh, she makes that. Oh, sorry. Then I'm not an expert in Hannah Arendt. Anyhow, well, if you connect that also to the scenery of the trial and the personas there, right? So it has to do with some voice echoed through the mask of the people. So it is described as some, I wouldn't say composition or symphony, but it is a conjecture of voices. Now, my last question is to Professor Ferrani about Al-Ghazali, and I wonder if the quote you just made from Al-Ghazali relates to his later life once he actually refuted philosophy and made the move towards mysticism. Then it's obviously the move from the spoken word to the unspeakable experience, obviously.
Unless I'm seriously mistaken, I think these are all just incredible ways for me to support when I'm what I'm trying to argue that I just kind of that I haven't done yet, that I haven't fleshed out yet. So I'm so grateful. I think, Chris, your suggestion about who's listening well is a fabulous one for the very reason that you say, because I can create a much wider rubric for understanding orality, and attribute a sense of orality to her interlocutors as well as to Hutchinson. So I think that's fabulous. It's like the thing that was staring me in the face that I didn't get. And Suzanne, your comment about the increasing emphasis on the visual in terms of the prophetic is also wonderful, because it suggests to me, I think I can let's put it this way, I think I can manipulate that information, that insight into arguing that Hutchinson herself is avoiding the very thing. I imply this, but I don't draw it out. She's avoiding the very thing that they find horrific, right? That they would find horrific, which is that she has a vision of God, right? Which she definitely doesn't. And Stephen, your suggestion about the Pequot War is also spot on. This has, of course, been part of the traditional scholarship about the antinomian crisis in general, right? That the antinomian crisis was. On the one hand, there are people who say that it didn't really exist at all. It was not even. It was just a blip in an otherwise, more or less successful, although fraught, colony that was getting its feet on the ground. And then there are, of course, others who say that this was part and parcel of this general sort of declension. I think if I had to say, I would say that the indicia were probably still, if I had to take a stand on that, I would say the indicia of grace were still very fiercely in the Puritans' favor, or at least that's how they read it. And certainly the Pequot War, as opposed to others, was a real easy war for the Puritans. This went in, killed a lot of people, came out. And it gave them, in fact, it's what led to part of the crisis in 1675 to 6 during King Philip's War, when they actually thought the same thing would happen all over again, and they were seriously mistaken, right? That King Philip War was really a nightmare for the Puritans, and they lost a ton of people. So I think the Pequot War, although interesting, I would read more as being a sign that they read it more as a sign from heaven that they were in fact in the right all along. So because it was such an easy win for them. So And Joseph, it's perfect. It's just perfect. I can use St. Paul and I can use Aaron and the notion of the persona. I'm thinking of Noonan's book on the persona as well, which has more of a visual notion of persona, right? And to go back, as you suggest, to this notion of Aaron and the etymology of the word in Latin is brilliant. I feel like I could rewrite the paper right now. In fact, I'd like to just take off and.
Just before you take off, there's something else that you. No. You said something that was so interesting to me, and then you kind of continued. And if you were going back to doing this, then maybe you could also indulge me. And the quote I'm looking at is when you say jurors functioned as a sounding board not only for the meaning of witnesses' words, but also for their authenticity. So a double listening, and this goes to what Chris was saying, how to listen properly. To this end, jurors were asked to hear on two planes at once, the aesthetic and the semantic. And I think that is, if you're talking about orality, right, so how to listen properly, that notion of listening in two ways, to me that opened up so many possibilities. So while you're going back there, I would really appreciate if you stayed here a little while longer.
Thank you. That's great. That's a great opening for it. Yeah.
Oh, well, that was actually a perfect segue into my question. Because I wanted to put some more pressure on the role of evanescence in your account. It seems to me that if you look at arguments in favor of orality, visuality, immediacy, given by commentators on English law in the Renaissance up through the 18th century, these are largely arguments about openness and transparency rather than evanescence. Now, in other words, one might say, "Oh, well, you could have both and." So the reason why I think rather than evanescence is that, for example, there's an emphasis on those who are in the courtroom, whether they're jurors or just members of the audience, being able to hear the evidence against the accused, being able to hear what was said, for example, by the accused at the detention stage, following the Marian committal statutes, which allowed for interrogation of the defendant after they were arrested, but before the trial, and it didn't matter, in fact, who read this stuff out in court. That is, it was perfectly fine for this dialogue between the person who examined the witness, who examined the accused and the accused. It was perfectly fine for that to be read out by somebody else. So there's clearly no sense here that some particular cadence of speech, is being captured by virtue of a direct interaction between the accused and the person who did the examination at that time. All that matters is that everyone in the courtroom be able to know what the accusation was, what was said in response to it, etc. So I think actually that the role of evanescence, look, that may very well be Hutchinson's reading of what's achieved by all of these requirements about producing it in court. And I mean, it sounds like you've got a very good account of that. That is that this is Hutchinson's take on it. Whether that's really what proponents of immediacy and the live trial themselves are after is another question. However, I think some more general evidence in favor of your point about openness. So we do have these Marian committal statutes. You look at Sir Thomas Smith's unpublished treatise in praise of the laws of England, written in the mid 17th century. He's one of the people who sort of explains very emphatically why it's so great that all of this is available for people to hear and see. And if you look at Bushell's case in 1670, another trial, by the way, about inappropriate preaching, the defense of the jury and the defense of the jury's fact-finding ability in that case is precisely that they're going to have their own understanding of what they saw and what they heard, and it's important to credit that. So I do think that there's sort of a good line of ongoing arguments by proponents of openness that are in service of the general point. And then the thought would simply be, if I follow correctly, that it's Hutchinson's sort of take on this, that it's about something that can only be seen in the moment at the time.
So I didn't catch this when reading, but in the 7-Eleven example.
You didn't see the part about 7-Eleven in there? Or?
I didn't see that. I didn't see that particular. No, but I didn't see the importance of that way of getting at, why we should think that in the first instance her claims about what the bad preachers were doing would be right. But regardless, the idea that you could preach a doctrine of the elect and still control your population, I think is deeply tied up with an idea of loneliness, right? This is sort of how Weber describes this, and so my question to myself here is about what is the lonely person here, if anything. I mean, that's the so I don't think that it's an implausible strategy for controlling the population, but I don't know exactly how it works. I mean, it seems to me that it is a main theme, and it has lots of effectivity. But I wonder what kind of relationship with orality one could bring out of it.
So, Roy, are you saying that preaching a doctrine of grace alone is not an implausible way to set up a society, or are you saying that?
It doesn't strike me as one that was unavailable. Yes, not implausible. I mean, given a whole lot of if, a lot of things about people actually being open to religious belief. Something that it's hard for me to experience, but it's something that I think I've seen historically. So.
Right.
No, I agree. That's why I think it's. Well, I agree. That's why I think it's important to. Because I think the emphasis on the oral, I think, is a wonderful insight into the antinomian controversy. But the reason I said the preachers are furious. Winthrop is furious at what they perceive to be a lack of listening on her part, because she is accusing them of she's accusing them of being Arminian, and they are not Arminian. They are not preaching a covenant of works. She hears them to be preaching the covenant of works, and they are resolute in their insistence that they are not doing that, and they're furious with her, and they want to run her out of the colony because she is challenging their authority. So, I mean, you could say, Calvin is building a successful society by preaching a covenant of grace. English Puritans are resolute in preaching a covenant of grace. So I don't see the covenant of grace as implausible at all. I think what's crucial here is to wrap everybody into what you're saying about Hutchinson. But I'm just repeating what I said earlier.
Yeah.
So.
Okay.
Okay.
I want to ask you. I really enjoyed the paper. I'm wondering about your idea of relating different sounds to different contexts, which sounds to me like a modern division of labor almost. And first I'm wondering historically, and this is out of ignorance, how plausible this would be for Hutchinson, right? How separate is common law from religion, for example, in that moment? And then theoretically, you seem to say that contexts predetermine, you say pre-semantically even, human voices and what they mean, right? So, if that is how you think of it, how does, I very much like you bringing sound back into the conversation, but that doesn't give sound a very strong performative or constitutive force. And I'm sort of wondering about that. Okay.
So I'm very drawn into this argument, and so much so that I want to kind of be a skeptic about it, and just to kind of pose the question of and this really this comes back to the difference or the tension between listening and hearing, right? That Khalid brought up, and that I think remains critical to the argument. But just from a skeptical standpoint, right? What if listening here, right, enters in as a kind of trope, right, as something that one says one is doing only to hear what one wants to hear, right? In other words, to really, that the idea or the performance of listening, right, is a strategy, right, that's deployed as a way, as a means of total refutation, so that Hutchinson and Winthrop are poised or kind of, are pitted against each other in a way that they always were, but invoking techniques that suggest that perhaps they've come around to articulating that that opposition differently. That doesn't actually address the question of the jury, which does actually, which is charged, or with an audience that is charged with hearing these different sides and with listening to the different sides and then hearing them, right? So that hearing connotes a certain kind of interpretation, which is why when one hears what one wants to hear, one isn't going to change one's subject position at all. But if one listens, perhaps one might. So I'm just offering a kind of skeptic standpoint. What would it mean to put listening not as an act, but as a trope?
Wow. Yeah. Wow. This is a harder group than the first set. So there was some discussion about the comment I made that isn't really a main feature of the written piece, to use my own sort of division on myself here between the oral and the written. Oral and written, but that I made while trying to give a précis of the piece, which is that I showed my true colors when I said that I thought the Puritans were actually preaching a doctrine of works or something like it, right, and not a doctrine of grace. So I'm not entirely sure I really even need to come down on one side or the other of that. Certainly when pushed, Hutchinson completely removed herself from that and simply said, as I point out in the paper, that she was distinguishing between good and better preachers, right? So she never fesses up that was part of her agenda at all. And to my mind, Winthrop and her other interlocutors don't make a good case for it. I loved your comment, Roy, about whether and Chris, that whether this is a kind of viable way of setting up a community. It's not entirely clear to me. All I'll say now, and I think the discussion is just too big for any one moment or any one room. But I think all I'll say is that the Puritans in New England, whom I know of all the Puritans, though they are the Puritans I know the best. Definitely were interested in creating a kind of collective response to what was coming out of the pulpit. And there was more surveillance what was being passed along. There was more self-similarity between what was going on, was coming out of the pulpits, than in other Puritan communities on the other side of the pond. And for me, that translates typically into a kind of compromise between what were sort of unadulterated versions of grace versus these communal evocations of grace that I think fueled Hutchinson's argument. I like the idea of what does the lonely person hear. I think this is, of course, it seems to me precisely what worried Winthrop, right? Because he didn't want Hutchinson to feel lonely in the slightest. He wanted to bring her back into the fold. So I'm not sure I'm really getting at your point, but I need to think more about it. So I don't think I'm going in any kind of order here, but Anat, your notion about different sounds in different contexts, I think I might want to pull back from my description of that in the paper, because I think what I want to say is not that as you put it, the context predetermines the voice, but rather that what one hears in one context is not necessarily what one can hear in another context, right? There's no way in which what Hutchinson or the ministers heard Hutchinson say by the window could ever be heard in court. It's just not. If you heard it by the window, it can't be heard in court, right? It's not that the voice is determined. It's that certain things can only be heard in certain places. So I want to make that point. I'm not sure I made it very successfully, but I want to make the point that it's orality that keeps on shifting and not orality. Wow, English really doesn't have a way of doing that, does it? I thank you, Ayelet, for your comment about the double listening, and I think that's exactly the moment in which I can insert a lot of the comments I'm getting to talk about the difference between aesthetic orality and semantic orality. I think that's great. And Simon, thank you for all of those references. That's amazing. I mean, and as far as the evanescence, I mean, as I was listening to you talk, I thought, I think Hutchinson is after it, but I'm not sure I really even need to go there. I think I could just go to this sort of, to openness and transparency. I mean, I can already see this paper getting so much better this is just amazing. Who am I missing? Ravit. I think I need to do a better job of describing what the difference is between listening and hearing. They don't really talk about listening, so hearing is really where it seems to be, and I'm not sure how to get away from how to distinguish, because I found myself slipping into listening. And I don't want to talk about listening. I think I want to talk about hearing, just hearing as this kind of sensual, ability. Of course, then you move toward the mystic, which is what I think Suzanne was sort of talking about, right? If you don't talk about meaning, if you talk about the aesthetics of orality as a sheerly disparate idea, then you move into a certain form of mysticism, which I also want to stay away from, because that's what they called her. So I think I can, and I think this goes back to your question, Anand, about what the difference is between the common law and there was a huge difference. They policed that border between the common law and divine law. I mean, when they slipped between it, they were very conscious of it. But they policed it very, very carefully. What I want to say about Hutchinson, of course, is that she was not some wacko mystic. Marilyn Westerkamp talks about this at some length, right? And she wasn't experiencing menopause. First of all, she was pregnant at the trial.
That's even worse.
She was pregnant at the trial, right? Right, I don't want to mention that either, right? Yeah, so I'm here to say that it wasn't menopause, it was pregnancy that made her confess to.
is out the window.
I know. Yeah. Anyway, I know everyone's super tired. I just want to thank you all for these unbelievably wonderful, generous comments. So thank you. I'm really happy.